Bill Elderman of the State Historical Society of Missouri, and we're talking today about two birds and a unique discovery in the Show Me State. Let's start with the man who made that discovery. Tell me about this man.
Okay, the discoverer was a gentleman named Otto Widmann. He was a German immigrant who was born in Baden, Karlsruhe, in 1841. And after the Civil War in 1866, he embarked on a tour of several spots in Europe. And I guess his intent was to come to America, because then he came to New York and also visited some other areas before finally settling in St. Louis. And he had trained as a pharmacist and businessman in Germany. And he opened he started working at a shop and was eventually very quickly the manager of the shop, and I guess purchased it, and was a pharmacist for some years. Now, what you won't find in a lot of the biographical information, but one of the letters that's in one of our collections, a guy named Daniel McKinley, tried to write a biography of Widmann, and I guess had to put it on the back burner to the point where he finally gave up on it, but he donated what he collected to the State Historical Society. And apparently, Widmann won a sweepstakes at a certain point. And even though his business was successful, winning this sweepstakes actually allowed him to retire at a relatively young age.
Oh.
And he had been interested in nature, and that was encouraged by his father in Germany. He really didn't settle on birds until he came to America. When he was in New York, he saw a little bird called an American redstart. And nowadays, people who are birders talk about their spark bird, the bird that got them interested in birds. And apparently, Widmann had never seen a redstart, and apparently that was one of his spark birds. The other one was a cardinal that he saw later. So he got interested in birds. And of course, he was so busy with developing his pharmacy business and doing that work that initially he wasn't able to do much about it. But then as the business got established, he became more successful, and then later, of course, retired. He started to devote more time to looking at birds. He had returned to Germany in 1872 and married while he was there. And his wife encouraged him also in this pursuit. I guess probably detected that he was overworking a little bit too much.
Okay.
But he wrote a brief autobiography in 1920s when he was nearing 90. And he talks about going to some areas in St. Louis that at the time were pretty much pristine forest. He specifically really enjoyed being in the River des Peres floodplain, which at the time was noted for having old forest with very massive trees. And he apparently liked it so much that he was willing to walk 8 miles one way. Even though it was in the city limits at the time, it was not served by streetcar, and spent many an hour in the River des Peres floodplain.
So when he is in St. Louis and working the pharmacy and getting interested in birds, is he talking to other people who are professional, if you will, and not amateur bird watchers? And is he forming any kind of a network?
It's kind of unclear whether that started after he retired or before. I'm sure he did connect with a few people in the St. Louis area beforehand. But upon his retirement, he moved out of the city to Old Orchard, and also was able to go out in some of the wetlands in St. Charles County at that time. And that's when he really started to network with people. He had a pretty vast collection of correspondence throughout Missouri, and he was able to visit a lot of areas himself as well, since he had the free time. His wife actually, I guess, contributed early on by buying him a gift set of a Birds of North America that was a popular book at the time. It
Yeah.
wasn't the Audubon birds. It was one that we don't think of much today. Struder was the author. And he apparently learned a lot about birds from that. And then later, his wife also gifted him a little cane uh, firearm, a little gun. At the time, optics weren't what they are today. And so a lot of people got interested in birds in order to identify some of the tougher ones would actually collect them and they'd start their own collection of skins, which was legal at the time. It's not today. And so he did have that to fall back on when the optics didn't do.
So where did he find the two warblers, and specifically the one that makes him unique to Missouri?
Well, I don't know what stimulated him to go to the Missouri boot heel. He went to several of the habitats around the state over time, but he apparently had some sort of connection that allowed him to. Uh, I got to scroll to. There was a family named Bertig in Arkansas that had become wealthy and purchased some land. And actually, there was a little town founded right on the Arkansas border on the St. Francis River. And the Bertigs also put in a hunting club and offered him the use of their hunting club to stay. And this was right at the end of a spur line of the railroad in the St. Francis River. Now, at
Mm.
the time, Missouri Boot Heel had not been drained, and the St. Francis River was had been altered heavily by the 1812 earthquake. A lot of areas had sunk, others had been pushed upward, and it was just a magnificently tangled mess. Apparently, people were able to navigate up the St. Francis River prior to the earthquakes, and that was no longer possible with large boats. And vast areas of wetland formed and or deepened. Widman mentions during spring the area along the state line. Sometimes the river was 7 miles wide during the spring floods. And
Wow.
the St. Francis Sunk Lands was also pretty vast swamp forest, cane breaks, and open habitats, all wet. Well, one of the first things that happened when he actually visited this area, he uh, started looking around, and early on, he found a bird called the Swainson's warbler, which had not been found in Missouri before. We are lucky enough today to actually still have Swainson's warblers in the state, although not there. They're mostly along the Ozark rivers today, and they have an affinity for native bamboo or cane. And
Hmm.
this area along the sunk lands, not only did you have this alteration with the earthquakes of the habitat, but the area had been densely settled by Native Americans very early on. And if you read much about Native Americans today, we know that there was probably upwards of as much as a 95% reduction in their population due to European diseases prior to very many Europeans getting to interior areas of the continent. So one of the sidelights of that, they had farmed this area extensively. And with the die-off in population, these farmlands were abandoned, these fields, and bamboo grows up in old disturbed areas. And so there were cane breaks that were upwards of 20 miles long, several miles wide in the St. Francis Sunk Lands and many other areas of the Boot Heel. And this Swainson's warbler has an affinity for that sort of habitat.
Mm.
So that would, understandably, Widman would have found them pretty commonly along the St. Francis River in the Sunk Lands. It's kind of an interesting sidelight story on Swainson's warbler. It's actually, the name comes from a British British uh, patron of Audubon, of John James Audubon, who gave money to Audubon to help defray the cost of publishing his ornithological biography. And so, in honor of him, when the Swainson's warbler was discovered, Audubon named it Swainson's warbler. Now, there's a move afoot today to eliminate all uh, human names from the names of birds. So we may see it named something else in the future, but it's been known as Swainson's warbler since its discovery.
And then there's the other one, Widman came upon, Bachman's warbler.
Or I guess the family, it was a Reverend John Bachman that it was named after. I think the family in that case pronounces their surname Bachman.
Okay.
And he was a minister in South Carolina, and he collected this little bird that he didn't know. So he was a friend of Audubon's. So he sent him skins of the bird, and it was described as a new species, and Audubon named it after his friend, Reverend Bachman. Interesting sidelight there. It was sent to Audubon, I think it was in the 18 teens. There was a period of about 80 years where there were just very few sightings of Bachman's warbler, and I'm not sure, but that might have just been a lack of effort. It was in pretty nasty habitats, overgrown and wetlands, and so it likely escaped notice to a certain degree. But when Widman went into this area, found Swainson's warblers, and very shortly thereafter found Bachman's warbler, no one had ever described or observed the nest and eggs of Bachman's warbler at that time. And the second year Widman went down there in the 1890s, he found a nest and was able to he sent it to a friend who wrote a description of it, and it was published in the ornithological literature.
And had anybody else found a nest like that since then?
There were nests found after that. I think Widman found some. There were others found elsewhere. The interesting thing was, if you read Widman's paper about his discovery, he talks about what the site was like. And a lot of people over the years have kind of associated Bachman's warbler with old swamp forest with huge trees, and that's not at all what Widman described. He describes a kind of a cleared area that was kind of tough to get around in, and one of the dominant plants was blackberries, which grow out in the open. So that's one thing we still haven't nailed down, because subsequently the bird has it's considered extinct today, is what the habitat really was for this bird. It was wetland. It was forested wetland, at least in or near, but was it actually the mature forest, or was it the understory of the mature forest? Some people have speculated they were also cane specialists, bamboo. Some have said clearings within the forest. We really don't know for sure.
Yeah, with it being extinct, I read about that, and it said loss of specialized habitat, but there's a question what that specialized habitat is to this day.
And there's also one school of thought that these things, Bachman's had a very restricted wintering distribution. I don't know if any were ever found, other than during migration, outside of Cuba and one of the offshore islands, Isle of the Pines. And so one other speculation is that it really wasn't the breeding habitat that was the problem. It was the wintering habitat and clearing for sugarcane farming, coupled with some pretty frequent hurricanes back in the early 20th century to mid 20th century.
So is it fair to call Whitman an ornithologist, or is he considered an amateur birder? Where does he fall in that?
Well, ornithology as a science has more or less developed out of a lot of interested amateurs. There were a few professionals. Obviously, in the late 1800s, there were a very limited number of academic and museum jobs where someone could actually be a professional ornithologist. So most of the contributions in that day and most of the articles you see in the professional journals were actually interested amateurs.
Hmm.
That's kind of, to a certain extent, gone by the wayside. There's still a ton of interested amateurs, but you've tended to see a division between scientific ornithology and birding. And I always tell people I consider myself both. Even though I do history now, my profession was I was a biology faculty member and I taught ornithology and wildlife biology classes. And my PhD is in wildlife ecology.
So this is right up your alley, studying him and the gifts he left the state of Missouri, the discoveries and the gifts he left.
Right. Of course, the culmination of Widman's work was he published a publication through the St. Louis Academy of Science, and they had a transactions series, and it was called A Preliminary Catalog of the Birds of Missouri, which it's interesting enough in that no one had ever actually collected everything about Missouri birds before that. But even more interesting to me is that he took 2 or 3 trips back to Germany after he emigrated. One, of course, to get married, but then he took one trip in 1902. And while he was gone, his house and old orchard burned to the ground, along with his notes, his diary. And he had written, people used to kind of divide the land birds from the water birds when they prepare something like that. He'd written the land birds section of the book, and it all burned.
Mm.
And so what you see today in the preliminary catalog is what he was able to put back together after he lost all of that, which
Oh,
is, to me, is just amazing. And I think that's where all of the correspondence that he had came in very handy. A lot of what you see in that book, he'll talk about other people's observations as well as his own. And it's because he was writing a lot of letters and people were sending him a lot of information. But to me, that's amazing. Most people, if they lose everything like that, they just give it up. But he
yeah.
did.
So his legacy may be passing down this preliminary catalog of birds of Missouri. Is that
That's the
what you
biggest
would say?
that's the biggest legacy he left.
Yeah.
To the wider field of ornithology, probably the nest and eggs of the Bachman's warbler and the observations he made of that species. But uh, for Missouri, it was the catalog. And most everything that's been written about Missouri birds since then starts out with the preliminary catalog.
That's just amazing that you have somebody come and settle in Missouri and make such a contribution here. If you are in Southeast Missouri in the Boot Hill, uh, if I'm in Cape Girardeau, can I stop in? Is there a museum? Is there a way I can see what you have, what the State Historical Society of Missouri has in terms of the letters you mentioned?
The letters are actually in Columbia.
Oh, okay.
Our research center here has only existed for a little over 10 years. And so collections that were donated to the society before that are elsewhere. We have quite a few that relate to this area of the state that are in Rolla, because that's where the Western Historical Manuscripts collection used to be housed. And then we have quite a few that are housed in Columbia, because of course that's the original facility was in Columbia. So we have quite a bit here, but and if you were to come here, you can make arrangements in advance and we'll make sure the collection you're interested in will be here waiting for you. We have a courier service or we move things around for the convenience of researchers.
So if you're a researcher, a scientist, or a birder just interested in this, you can contact the State Historical Society of Missouri, and you can look at the collection that the state has.
Yes.
Yeah.
And like I say, even in Springfield, we have a research center there. The materials could be forwarded to the Springfield Research Center where you could work on them there.
Well, good to know. Bill, I appreciate your time today, and I want to thank you for sharing your knowledge on this.
Well, certainly, anytime.